So one of the areas that I think is really kind of provocative and worth considering is sort of the crisis in higher education, right? So who defines higher education to be in crisis, and are the predictions of the number of schools that are scheduled or slated to close, is that an accurate prediction? And one of the things, Brent, I know we've talked quite a lot about this because of your work at Rutgers, and you really, through the Big Ten Academic Alliance, have had the chance to liaison with many of the other Big Ten schools, along with a number of colleges and universities across the country and internationally with your work. Um, what exactly do you see to be some of the major challenges on the horizon for higher education? And what are your thoughts on sort of that crisis prediction?
Well, so I think some of the predictions are perhaps a bit overdrawn. There's definitely some significant challenges higher ed's facing, and I'm sure there'll be some institutions that will be strained, and perhaps some that will merge or close, and some already have. But if you look at the long-standing history of higher ed, it's been around a long time, and I don't think that the functions that it serves are going to be absent anytime soon. But there are significant challenges, and certainly one of them is the slowness to change that is often attributed to higher education, and that's a leadership issue. I think we tend to over-celebrate our successes of the past and be maybe less attentive to what we could do differently. And so, this has to do, again, very much with the kind of leaders that we recruit. We tend to recruit people who have been successful in higher ed already, and that's a good thing in a way because they bring the expertise and experience that they've developed over time. But the downside of that might be that some of the new perspectives that they could bring, perhaps even if they came from other sectors, and that's a topic that could be talked about as well, pluses and minuses there. But some of the insights that you would bring if you were from a different background or had some different training probably could be an asset to higher education, and perhaps a bit undervalued up to this point in time.
Yeah, I tend to agree with much of what you offered there. And we talk a bit about this countercultural need for agility and for moving quickly and adapting to a changing environment. Yet higher education at its very core is slow moving and deliberative. And through, a shared governance structure that we have and that we hold sacred, it sort of adds to the slowness by which we lead.
It does, and I think that, again, a plus and a minus there because there's been a stability and a continuity over time because there haven't been a lot of knee-jerk reactions to change. On the other hand, there are times when perhaps that change is well motivated, and where being adaptive to some of the changes in the marketplace and so on would be a thing that we ought to attack a little more aggressively than we do.
Yeah. Chris, are there other challenges that come to mind for you? I think it's a great list, Brent.
What I'm wondering about is the ability to communicate our value to the public. I feel like that's been lacking, and so I feel like that's a huge challenge for leaders. And what's the solution, or what are some ideas on how to approach that?
I think that's a huge issue, and in fact, it's good you brought it up, because if you were to try to identify the number one issue facing higher ed right now, it might indeed be that kind of a crisis in confidence in the work we do, partly wrapped up in some questioning about what the value of research and whether it's becoming politicized. That's a debate we probably don't want to get into here, but I think that when you are dedicated to research and you're trying to approach it in a non-political way, and then you find sometimes that there's an assumption that perhaps it's politically motivated here and there, or questioning the validity of what you're doing, I think that's a problem, and probably we've played into that a little bit within the academy because we've assumed everybody should understand the value that we're adding through our research, and that everyone should understand the applicability of it and see how all our research will translate into practical knowledge. I think we need to be paying more attention to telling our story better. And again, it's a leadership issue because the whole issue of how people understand what we do, many people don't. So I think more attention to that is something that we all need to work on.
One of the we'll maybe get to this a little bit later as well as we think about what differentiates higher education as a sector from other types of industries or organizational sectors that exist. But the wide array of stakeholders that have an interest in what we do is expansive, from parents and students to legislatures and members of the community or employers who are looking for new hires from our institutions. So there's so many different stakeholders that are looking to us for the answer or looking to us for some sort of solution to a problem that they're facing. And I think that that's also adding to this crisis of confidence, is because to some stakeholders we're really fulfilling our core mission, yet these core missions are competing in some ways from one another based on the stakeholders who are looking to us for those solutions.
It's a really key issue, the whole question of multiple stakeholders, as you mentioned, and different orientations and different thoughts. So some of the stakeholders look to us to be a training ground for jobs, right? And that we should prepare people for jobs. That's our primary mission. And of course, that's a reasonable point of view. But I think particularly when you talk to people within higher education, they also see a broader view that we should be training people to participate effectively in democracy, to be critical problem solvers, to be effective in relationships, and that it isn't really easy to measure right when you graduate by how effective your first job is or how much money you make is not necessarily a good measure of the ultimate benefit of higher education.
Yeah. Yeah, we nodded because of our experiences in the classroom. We think about this quite a bit with the students that we've worked with and interacted with, who many of whom would see value in that and sort of see the roles that they can play in moving forward with a more careful understanding of what's needed in a democracy, or the relationships that are really struggling because of a lack of understanding of communication fundamentals or leadership principles, whatever it might be.
And it underscores the need that we've talked about a bit earlier, and that is really the leadership needs to be able to tell the story, the broad story of what higher education adds in the way of value, and it requires an ability to talk to different stakeholders in different kinds of ways, because there are different needs and there are different understandings and different lenses through which people are looking at what we do.
Yeah, so let's talk about that a little bit more. And Chris, if you have other thoughts about sort of the advice that we could offer to aspiring leaders in higher education. And I know Brent, through the center here, the Center for Organizational Leadership, in many ways we're sort of seen as internal consultants for the university to help provide guidance and counsel for leaders that might be facing any number of challenges currently or on the horizon. When working with a faculty or staff member who sees the potential for leadership in their future, what kind of advice do you tend to offer them? I think this communication piece and having a really cogent and clear elevator pitch for why higher education exists and the purposes that we serve is really key. Are there other things that come to mind?
Well, I think with that, the underemphasized part of communication is the listening and observing piece. In other words, you have these different constituencies that you need to be effective in relating to, but we're not necessarily naturally understanding where they're coming from. Employers might be one example, or parents might be another example. Legislature might be another one. So before you can deliver the message well, you actually need to understand where the people that you're trying to communicate with are coming from, what's on their agenda, how do they think about these things, and that seems to be the starting point. And it's probably the underemphasized part of communication, the inputting part of communication, right?
Well, in the writing that we did for a higher education book with Richard DeLisi, the former dean of the Graduate School of Education at Rutgers, Chris, we use this idea of the organizational ethnographer as our way of making sense of the role of the leader. So as a new leader, to be able to navigate the rugged and uncertain terrain of higher education calls for a really careful understanding of the climate and a careful understanding of the unique needs of the people that you're working with. So having the ability, to your point, Brent, that's so observant about asking the right questions, carefully being aware of what's needed in the environment. And I also think part of the leadership challenge is pivoting between the past, the present, and the future, right? Having an understanding of the mission and the history of any organization or any university, embracing sort of where we are in the present, constantly with an eye towards where we are going next. It's much easier said than done, right? But to be able to sort of pivot across these three domains well calls for agility, but also calls for a really careful understanding of the many stakeholders who are looking for various answers to the past, present, and future as well.
You know, when we've talked about sort of the tensions between the various external stakeholders that a leader faces, but you can't help but also think of the challenges that you face internally, because you've got whatever level of leader you are, you have those that you're responsible for who report to you, and there are certain needs and perspectives they have, and then there are the people you report to who have oftentimes somewhat of a different set of needs and perspectives, and so the skills in listening have to be internally focused and utilized with stakeholder groups inside as well as outside. So, you know, you add all this together, makes for a pretty specific and pretty consequential challenge for leaders.
There's an exercise I do in my class with the undergrads looking at stakeholder interest in power. And the context we're talking about is the digital context. So we do an exercise where we're looking at a case and we're mapping the different stakeholders who are not always obvious in class, which is interesting. So you really have to push people to think about who are the stakeholders we're leaving out of this conversation. And then we map them, their degree of power, and also their degree of interest in the subject. And then we talk about how, because of social media and other digital technologies, that interest and power can flip
It's really,
in a moment. It's really interesting.
Yeah. And you can envision something like that for higher education leaders, maybe at the early stages of a strategic planning process where they're engaged in some similar routine, looking at the many stakeholders and their level of power and interest in what we do. Yeah, I love that idea.
And even with your interest in crisis in higher education, you know, the importance of sitting down and thinking about who are the stakeholders, you know, what is their interest in this matter, what is their power, and what factors can change that.
Yeah, and one piece to that I think is just so interesting, and if we look at the many kinds of crisis situations facing higher education, challenges, crises, however you choose to define them, oftentimes if there's the perception of a challenge or the perception of a crisis, then it requires the attention of the leader. So many things that bubble up to this sort of national scandal really started on the ground and were caused from a lack of understanding or a lack of careful scrutiny by the individual leader, right? So the many stakeholders with many interests at stake, but also various perceptions of whatever the situation might be.
You know, a point that you've emphasized in some of your work that even goes a little beyond what you just mentioned is that it's one thing to learn to mitigate a crisis once it's developed as a leader. You know, there's a crisis and you try to use communication to address it and lessen the impact that it has. But the bigger picture that you talk about is preventing crisis and how you make certain that the values of the institution are permeating everyday practice, and so that you hopefully don't have these crises, or when they begin to occur, they bubble up through a natural process and they can be addressed early on rather than waiting till they become, you know, really insurmountable in their consequence.
Excellent, because the ways then, you know, crisis has a history and these challenges have a history, so the ways in which leaders are able to demonstrate credibility and demonstrate sort of these core values before the crisis occurs can really help one to navigate in a really value-centered way, which is probably good advice for any aspiring leader as well.
Absolutely.
Able to demonstrate credibility and demonstrate sort of these core values before the crisis occurs can really help one to navigate in a really value-centered way, which is probably good advice for any aspiring leader as well.
Absolutely.